We're
I'm so
deciding.
confused.
Don't.
Yeah,
don't-
George, you need to
We
give
don't talk
some
about
serious
him.
consideration to getting a life.
Oh my god.
A moment of silence, everyone.
All right, today we're taking a look at communism in China. We're going to start at the top of page 55 with everyone's favorite, our dynasty song. That's right, today we finally have gotten all the way through the song and beyond. So you sing along if you want. Otherwise, just skip forward because it's going to be pretty unbearable. In a 5, 6, 7, 8. Sheng Zhao Qin Han. Sui Tang Song. Yuan Mingqing Republic. Mao Zedong. Wow, that was beautiful. Now, to help you with writing your context, I have here actually broken down each dynasty. We saw this actually in our Units 1 and 2 packet back in the fall, but it's just a refresher of the contributions of each dynasty. We left off with the Qing, with things like the Boxer Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, and other consequences of Western imperialism throughout the 1800s. And today we're going to start with the collapse of this dynastic system in 1911. So if you look on this timeline, I'll run through it with you. So basically in 1911, 1912, we saw the collapse of this dynastic system, which had lasted in China for literally thousands of years. Because of these ideas of nationalism, democracy, and livelihood, which were present in liberal revolutions we saw from the American Revolution in 1776 to Latin American revolutions in the beginning of the 1800s to the cacophony in Europe in 1848 and on through the rest of the 1800s. These were some of our biggest themes from our last unit, and now they're starting to reach the people of China as the Manchurian dynasty or the Qing dynasty slowly opened up its borders. So in 1920, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 and the implementation of communism in Russia, we start to see Mao Zedong and his Communist Party gaining support from Chinese peasants, mostly because of the economic turmoil that comes with this sort of political shift. It actually led to a civil war, which started in China around 1927 and continued on really until the late 1940s, 1950s, with a short pause for World War II, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But basically, through this process, Chinese communists slowly but surely gained influence over the public. They had popular support and were able to win after a hiatus during World War II. I think I've mentioned before, there were more civilian casualties in China than in any other country in the world during that conflict, which is important to note. So we have a renewed civil war following the end of World War II. If you want to pause the video, take a moment to answer these questions in your packets, and then I will go over them with you. So how was Mao able to gain support from Chinese peasants, and how did this affect the nationalists? Well, he promised land, right? And we've seen that being effective throughout history, as early as Shi Huangdi redistributing land amongst Chinese peasants. And because of that, the communists, rather than the nationalists, had popular support. And despite the support that the United States was providing to the nationalists, they weren't able to prevail. And how is the Civil War intensified by the Cold War? As we've seen in hotspots all around the world, the United States and the Soviet Union are getting involved. The United States, as it says here, providing nearly $2 billion in aid to nationalist forces. And later, once China does become communist, they form an alliance with the Soviets. In 1949, after winning this civil war, Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China and launched a 5-year plan and the Great Leap Forward. I'm going to switch back to the slides for this. Just to explain the 1949 box where it says Chairman Mao established the People's Republic of China, what that means is that the communists led by Mao Zedong won this civil war. The civil war was being fought between the communists who formed in the 1920s and the nationalists, or the KMT party, that overthrew the Qing dynasty in 1911. At the end of the Chinese Civil War, from 1945 to 1949, communist forces were able to push nationalist forces from north to south to the point where after 1950, the only area controlled by the KMT, or the Nationalist Party, was Taiwan. And still today, we see the relationship between Taiwan and mainland China defined by this conflict, where there's a vastly different system of governance in Taiwan today than there is in mainland China. So I'll post an article about that relationship, as well as the relationship between Hong Kong, which was a British protectorate until 1997, I think, in mainland China. So I'll post an article if you want to learn more about that. But looking at Mao Zedong's 5-year plan, launched very shortly after the People's Republic of China was established. This 5-year plan was very similar to the one we saw under Stalin in the Soviet Union and Low-key Nehru in India. The goal essentially was to increase industrial production. They wanted to draw more laborers from agriculture so that they could be used to work in industry. So that required the collectivization of farmland, the use of more agricultural technology. And the first of these 5-year plans was successful. But the Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, by most historians' measures, was a failure. This phase of collectivization, by which land was taken from landlords and wealthy peasants and given to poorer peasants to form communes, these larger plots of land, which were being worked by fewer laborers, wasn't able to produce the amount of food required for the nation. And just like we saw in Russia under Stalin, we had widespread famine, people starving to death because of the failure of this plan. Now, before we look at the Cultural Revolution that Mao Zedong launched after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, we're going to look at the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese peasants. You're going to be evaluating and explaining the impacts that the Communist Party had on the peasant class to demonstrate either a beneficial or harmful relationship between Chinese peasants and the Chinese Communist Party. So I think we've done this in class before, but you'll pull any piece of evidence out of the source as that impact that the Communist Party had on peasants. Make an evaluation, was it beneficial or harmful? Indicate where you see that and explain why this is a benefit or a harm from your assigned perspective. If you are working in a group, you have 4 different individuals, 4 different perspectives. One will be making their assessments from the point of view of a peasant farmer, from a Chinese nationalist, a Chinese communist, and a landlord. So when you look at the relationship between the peasant class and the Communist Party, was that relationship beneficial or harmful? You'll do it from your perspective, your assigned perspective. If you are working with a group, you will complete steps 2, 3, 4, and 5. If you're working on your own, just steps 4 and 5. And the perspective you'll take on is just a historian's perspective. Please make sure you set a 10-minute time limit for sources 1 through 8. It likely means you won't be able to read all of the sources. If you can, that's great. But set a 10-minute limit for reading the sources and filling out step 2, and then go on to step 3, 4, and 5 with your group. Now we're going to take a look at Mao's Cultural Revolution. This was launched shortly after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, when Mao felt pressure to return China to its communist roots and boost the nation's confidence in communist values. Many of this was done forcefully in Mao's Cultural Revolution, which was launched in 1966, calling on the nation's youth to purge the impure or more modern Western capitalist elements of Chinese society and revive the revolutionary spirit of the Civil War in the 1940s. This should say years, by the way, not decades. Nation schools were closed in 1966, and children were recruited to Red Guards. These were essentially child armies. And actually later, after these notes, when you go to the bottom of this page, you're going to be reading from these little red books. You see them all holding here, and see just how impactful the messaging was on China's youth. So these were little military groups, the Red Guard, both literally like little people and little groups, who would target China's elderly, intellectual, and religious population. I've had students in the past whose parents or grandparents owned bookshops during the Cultural Revolution and were targeted by the Red Guard. Ask your parents if you know you've had family in China to see how their parents or grandparents may have been impacted by this movement. But there were violent means used, but very rarely death. One example you'll see in a video later is that a member of the Red Guard cut a teacher's hair. It was more meant to humiliate than physically harm. Once you've used the PDF called Cultural Revolution and the 2 YouTube videos attached to fill out the bottom of page 62, we'll go through our last page, 63, together with some guided notes. So, in the first box, Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1976. I don't know why I have 1978 written there, but he focused on restructuring China's education and economic policies. So that meant repairing the damage that had been done during the Cultural Revolution to China's education system and moving toward a more capitalist, or just implementing capitalist reforms. China still today is technically a communist state, but we see a lot of capitalist policies, such as limited business and property ownership, joint ventures with foreign companies, that can largely be attributed to Deng Xiaoping. In the 1970s and 80s, we see the 4 modernizations. You can actually leave those boxes blank on page 63 because you see that they're focusing on modernizing agriculture, industry, science and technology, and defense, just integrating more modern technologies into those industries to make them more productive and effective. And through this process, we actually see students studying abroad, like traveling from China to study around the world and bringing that knowledge back to Chinese industries. And with the improvement to China's education system, hand in hand with these modernizations and capitalist reforms, we see China becoming a major global economic power. So for 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre, there's a video attached called Tiananmen Square Massacre for you to watch, just to give you a better idea of how Deng Xiaoping still maintained strict control of the population, even while implementing these capitalist reforms and improving education in China. And there's an optional article attached to read about neocolonialism, China's neocolonialism in Africa, to the present, for the box at the very bottom. So again, for the 1989 box, you'll watch let me show you on here. So for the 1989 box, you'll watch a video called the Tiananmen Square Massacre. And then there's an optional article for you to learn a little bit about China's neocolonialism today.